It was at this moment that he knew.
It is somewhat anachronistic to talk about Nietzsche and gay rights. It's somewhat anachronistic even to talk about Nietzsche and homosexuality, because that very concept was in flux at that time. But this is a great example of a passage that makes no sense at all if you are not willing to admit to yourself that Nietzsche was gay and that Nietzsche was intensely interested in what we would now call gay rights. At the present time, it seems that, under all kinds of false, misleading names, and mostly amid great uncertainty, those who do not regard themselves as being bound by existing laws and customs are making the first attempts to organize themselves and therewith to create for themselves a right. Pause. It's literally true that the very first examples of gay rights movements, certainly in the history of Germany, were happening at just that time. And there is evidence that Nietzsche was interested in them. But if you don't believe this passage has anything to do with homosexuality, what rights do you think he's talking about? Do you think he's talking about the abolition of slavery? Do you think that's what Nietzsche's interest was? Do you think that was his interest in Europe in his own century? Or do you think that was his interest in contrasting ancient Greece and ancient Rome to Europe? When he's talking about getting back to the virtues and vitality and unchained youthfulness of ancient Greek culture, do you think he's saying he wants to go back to slavery? Do you think he's talking about the rights of slaves or the rights of slave owners here? It's totally incoherent if you don't admit to yourself that he's talking about homosexuals and homosexuality. I continue the quotation. While hitherto they had lived corrupt and corrupting, denounced as criminals, free thinkers, immoral persons, and villains, and under the ban of being outlaws and living in bad conscience, who is he describing? Who in the history of Europe at that time? What struggle is it that he's writing about here as a political philosopher? When I skip ahead to the next passage underlined in red, men who deviate from the usual path and are so often the inventive and productive men shall no longer be sacrificed. He's not talking about slavery. He's not talking about the rights of black slaves. Maybe he should be. Maybe Nietzsche would have been a more interesting philosopher if that's what he'd taken an interest in. He's talking about the people who are denounced as criminals, as immoral persons in Germany at that time, who are sometimes the most inventive and productive men. That's the liberation, that's the breaking of chains that he's concerned with. I am going much further than the article by Charles Stone in recklessly asserting to you that Nietzsche's work is full of these examples, full of passages that are self-indulgent, meandering, meaningless, and incomprehensible if you do not interpret them as being in this same way really about homosexuality. And his own experience as a repressed homosexual had to rebel against his Christian cultural programming and rediscover what it was for him to be a man who had sex with other men in ancient Greek and Roman texts. No God and no man, only their own youth. Unfetter it, and you will have free life along with it. What do you think this means? What does it mean to unfetter one's own youth, to break through the chains of German culture and return to these Greco-Roman ideals of the past? Let me just ask, this passage, it's otherwise just meandering horse shit. Do you think he's talking about democracy? Do you think he's talking about how much he cares about democracy in ancient Athens and Rome? No, not at all. Oh, it is sick this unfettered life and must be healed. What's he talking about there? People in Germany perceive homosexuality as an illness, but he doesn't. And authors like Plato, right, from ancient Athens, they don't either. Many ills ail it, and it does not only suffer from the memory of its fetters, it suffers so far as we are principally concerned here from the historical malady. What do you think he's talking about? If youth did not have the clairvoyant gift of nature, no one would know that it is a malady and that a paradise of health has been lost. What do you think? The paradise of health, of rediscovering your youth by breaking the change. What do you think he's on about here? If you don't interpret Nietzsche as a homosexual, the vast majority of his corpus of texts, of philosophical musings, it's meaningless horseshit. Generations of Nietzsche scholars, as Kohler says, have racked their brains over the question concerning the source of the term Übermensch. If you have been cursed with a university education, you were probably told by some professor somewhere that no, it's totally inappropriate to look at what Nietzsche uses this term to mean, as if it implicitly had the same meaning that we associate with Adolf Hitler, that we associate with a subsequent generation of German fascists. But what did Nietzsche mean? Where did he borrow this word from? What is the contrast between superhuman and subhuman that matters to Nietzsche, writing in his time for his audience in the pursuit of his own political purpose or political project? I continue reading, quote, "Yet there is another book thus far ignored in the voluminous Nietzsche literature that deals precisely with the restoration of ancient Greek love, in which that fateful word Übermensch appears. The work in question is Heinrich Husserl's Apology for Same-Sex Love, referred to as Eros, in The Greek Love of Males, first published in 1836. Stripped to its essentials, Husserl's thesis was that the ancient Greeks had much to teach modern Europeans, just like Nietzsche. Oh, and again, what was Nietzsche's interest? Did it have to do with democracy? Nietzsche is fascinated by this moral contrast between Christian Europe, ancient Greece, ancient Rome. But what is his fascination? Because it's not democracy, it's not slavery, it's not any of these other things. Husserl believed that same-sex love, far from being despicable in the Christian sense, quote, the bestial defilement of our nature and the sin of Sodom, close quote, represented something divine. When, he asks, will we finally cease to regard Greek eros as degenerate and recognize that this power made possible all of the extraordinary cultural accomplishments of the Hellenes, of the ancient Greeks? It is no accident, he says, that the gods rewarded heroic male lovers with eternal life on the mythic Blessed Isles, a phrase that Nietzsche used in the title of one of Zarathustra's speeches. It is here that the key word Übermensch appears. From our non-humans, they formed superhumans. Non-humans doesn't sound natural in English. We would say inhumans, subhumans. Who are the subhumans? They are the oppressed homosexuals of Germany, of Christian Western Europe at that time. Here we have very clearly this idea of rebelling against culture and education in order to make the transition from being subhuman or inhuman to being fully human, right? Here it's not stated as the Übermensch, as from subhuman to superhuman, right? At this point, they have become human again. And how do we arrive at the goal, you will ask? Well, of course, you can just look ahead here. It's a return to ancient Greek culture. What is it that interests him from ancient Greece? Is he interested in olive oil? Is he interested in sports? Is he interested in wrestling or throwing javelins? Is he interested in comedy from ancient Greek. Theater, no. He's not even interested in democracy from ancient Greece. What he is interested in reviving is Greek eros, Greek love. That's it. His interest is Plato's Symposium, in brief. How do we arrive at that goal, you ask? Already at the beginning of a journey to that goal, the Delphic god calls his motto to you, know thyself. He's a homosexual man addressing a homosexual audience about their essence, their inner nature. But you have to know, it is a hard motto, for that God does not conceal and does not reveal, but only indicates, as Heraclitus has said. What does he point out to you? There have been centuries in which the Greeks found themselves in a danger similar to the one in which we find ourselves, namely of being swamped by what is alien and past and of perishing through history, right? For a long time, their culture was overwhelmed by Semitic, Babylonian, Lydian, and Egyptian forms and concepts. What do you think? What's his concern? What is it he wants to rescue about ancient Hellenic culture so that he can feel fully human again, not dehumanized? What is the significance of the contrast between subhuman and superhuman? He is saying very clearly, as Nietzsche does also, in my opinion, we who are treated as subhuman in this society now were Übermenschen, were superhuman in ancient Greece and Rome. This, Charles Stone says, this is a paradigm-shattering assessment. And here I recognize the mission of that youth, that first generation of fighters and serpent slayers, which precedes a happier and more beautiful culture and humanity without having more than an inkling of the promise of this future happiness and beauty to come. What do you think he's talking about? What do you think he's talking about there? You think he's talking about Adolf Hitler's dystopia? Not at all. This youth will suffer from the malady and the antidote at the same time. And nevertheless, they believe themselves to be entitled to boast of stronger health and in general of a more natural nature than their forebearers, than the educated men and old men of the present. Who's he talking about? What are these chains he's talking about breaking that will return you to a more natural nature, to a type of happiness and beauty that you're currently cut off from? But it is their mission to shake the concepts which the present has of health and education, right? The idea of health, the idea of hygiene in Germany at that time, right? What it is that gay men are being forced to accept as science or pseudoscience as part of their education. Thus, science requires a higher supervision and guarding, a hygiene of life. In this historical period, right, masturbation is forbidden. It's considered unhygienic. The notion of hygiene is applied in a way that today sounds insane to us, to sexual morality. Homosexuality and masturbation, these things are violations of the pseudo-scientific notion of hygiene. So what's he saying here? The unhistorical and the superhistorical are the natural antidotes to the stifling of life by history, to the historical malady. It is probable that we, the historically sick, who's he talking about? Who is it that in the history of Germany has been declared sick and that he's trying to redeem and saying, we're not sick at all? And that by going back and rereading texts from ancient Athens and Rome, he recaptures his sense of self-esteem, that he's not sick, that he's not psychotic or evil or born contorted just because he's homosexual. We, the historically sick, will also have to suffer from the antidotes. But that we suffer from them is no proof that the treatment is incorrect. What do you think he's talking about here? And to generate ridicule and hatred against such hybrid concept monsters. And the hallmark of their own robust health is to be just this, that they, namely this youth, can themselves use no concept, no party slogans from the present store of current word and concept coinage to designate their own essence. What essence do you think that is? What do you think he's talking about? If it's not about homosexuality, it's complete bullshit.